Welcome back, focused learners. Today on The Explainer, we are diving into one of the most audacious, transformative, and quite frankly, tragic events in modern history. We're talking about a grand continental heist that literally reshaped the globe. We're going to walk through the Scramble for Africa, a story of unimaginable wealth, arbitrary lines on a map, and a legacy that is absolutely still dictating global politics today.
Here's our roadmap for today's Explainer. We'll start with the setup, move to the blueprint, and then examine the execution. After that, we'll look at the pushback, and finally, the sequel, where we'll connect this 19th century history to the modern rush for green energy.
All right, part one, the setup, the perfect storm.
To really understand how an entire continent was carved up so incredibly fast, we have to rewind to just before the 1880s. And I want you to think about this number, 10%. That's it. Before the 1880s, European powers controlled barely 10% of the African continent, and they were strictly stuck to coastal trade outposts and slave ports. To the Western world, the massive interior was a total mystery. They even called it the Dark Continent. But a huge shift was brewing.
So why the sudden scramble? Well, it was a three-pronged perfect storm that suddenly made Africa the ultimate prize. First up, economics. The Industrial Revolution was absolutely booming, right? European factories were desperate for raw materials. They needed millions of tons of rubber for new tires and palm oil to grease their heavy machinery. Second, politics. Brand new nations like Germany and Italy wanted to flex their muscles and prove they were global superpowers by getting their own place in the sun. And third, you had religious and moral justifications. Explorers and missionaries believed in this so-called civilizing mission to bring Western commerce and Christianity to the continent.
Moving on to part two, the blueprint, the great map-making.
This perfect storm needed a strategy, and that blueprint was drawn up thousands of miles away. Get this, between 1884 and 1885, 14 European nations got together for the Berlin Conference. This just brilliantly captures the sheer audacity of this whole heist. You have 14 European nations sitting around a table, drawing arbitrary straight lines across a map, literally slicing right through existing ethnic groups and mushing rival tribes together. And 0 African leaders were invited. Not a single one. The fate of an entire continent was decided in a total vacuum. The most crucial thing they established at this conference was a rule called effective occupation. Basically, you couldn't just point at a map and say, hey, that's mine. A European power legally had to have a physical presence on the ground, boots on the ground. And this specific rule acted like a starting pistol. It triggered this frantic, incredibly chaotic sprint among these nations to rush into the African interior and physically plant their flags. That brings us to part three, the execution, the players and the prizes. With the rules set, the sprint was on. The two biggest players here had totally competing game plans. The British Empire dreamed of a Cape to Cairo strategy, basically a continuous, unbroken line of colonies running from Egypt in the north all the way down to South Africa. Meanwhile, the French Empire went with a west-east strategy, gobbling up a massive, solid block of territory across northwest Africa. Just those two empires alone swallowed up vast portions of the map. Now, we really need to pause here for a second because the tone shifts dramatically. Not all of these colonies were state-run. In what is truly one of history's greatest atrocities, King Leopold II of Belgium claimed the Congo Free State entirely as his own private, personal business venture. His ruthless obsession with extracting rubber for the Industrial Revolution was enforced with horrific brutality, and it resulted in the deaths of millions of Congolese people. This whole era carries an incredibly heavy toll. Germany got a late start in the scramble, but they ended up seizing territories like Togo, Cameroon, and Namibia. In Namibia, their colonial enforcement led to what historians actually record as the first genocide of the 20th century, committed against the Herero and Namakwa people. It's a sobering, deeply tragic reminder that these lines drawn on paper were enforced through devastating human suffering. When you zoom out and look at the timeline, the sheer speed of this takeover is just staggering. From barely 10% control before the 1880s to the Berlin Conference in 1884 to a shocking 90% European control by 1914. This 30-year heist only paused for one reason. The European powers literally ran out of land to steal and eventually just turned their weapons on each other when World War I broke out. Let's look at part four, the pushback, resistance, and the exception. It is absolutely vital to understand that the African continent did not simply submit. Africans didn't just sit idly by. across the entire continent. Invading Europeans faced highly sophisticated, fierce armed resistance. From the Anglo-Zulu War in the south, to the Mahdist War in Sudan, to the Asante resistance in Ghana, local populations organized incredible military and strategic campaigns to defend their homelands.
And that brings us to the legendary Ethiopian exception. In 1896, at the Battle of Adwa, Emperor Menelik II led the Ethiopian forces to a brilliant, decisive victory over the invading Italian army. Because of this massive military triumph, Ethiopia ensured its place as the only major African nation to never be colonized. It stands as a monumental moment of resistance.
Finally, Part 5, the sequel, Legacy and the 2026 Scramble.
You know, history isn't just about the past. It directly dictates the present. One of the most lasting impacts of the scramble is the creation of extraction economies. Think about the colonial railroads and ports built during that era. They were designed for one single purpose: getting resources out to the ocean as fast as possible. They were not built to connect African nations to each other. That structural hangover, along with those artificial borders from Berlin, is still a major hurdle for internal African trade today. Which leads us right into the new scramble. Here in 2026, Africa is the world's fastest growing continent, and we're kind of watching a sequel unfold. The old scramble of 1884 was a territorial grab for rubber and palm oil. Today's new scramble is an economic competition. Global powers like China, Russia, and the US are fiercely competing for access to Africa's critical minerals. We're talking about cobalt and lithium, literally the exact materials powering the smartphone in your pocket and the entire global green energy transition. But here is where the story shifts, and it's a real game changer. Unlike 1884, modern African nations are definitely at the table. Through organizations like the African Union and the African Continental Free Trade Area, the continent is uniting. They're leveraging their collective power to make sure that this new economic scramble actually benefits African growth, African infrastructure, and African people first. So, what does this all mean? The original Scramble for Africa was a 30-year heist that transformed an entire continent into a series of colonial spreadsheets. It built the modern map of Africa, but at a staggering, deeply tragic human cost. As we watch these thriving young African cities navigate the global economy of 2026, I want to leave you with this final, profound question to consider. Can a continent ever truly erase lines that were drawn in ink but enforced in blood? Thank you for joining me on The Explainer today, Focus Learners. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.